All right, we're recording now.
Excellent.
Okay, thank you for coming on. Daniel, this is Daniel for everyone who doesn't know. Everyone should know him. Everyone should go to the description of the
Oh,
video right
goodness.
now. Go
You're
subscribe to
very
his
kind.
channel. And why don't we begin? Why don't you just introduce what do you do? Yeah.
Well, thank you, Trey. That's very kind of you. Daniel, you mentioned it. Write with my wife, work under O.G. Rose, Opperman Garner Rose, that we work together. Lots in the philosophy field. We do fiction, creative writing. We live on a farm, run a wedding venue. We have 3 kids. Living the dream. Very, very fortunate, very blessed. And thank you for this opportunity, Trey. The work you do on the different things, like your work on Zizek and the Wired Brain, on the Son of Time, all that work is just very well put together, well articulated. And I actually had a chance to review the one where you go through your favorite books. And it reminded me of the part in the Underground Man where he was on the street and the police officer moved him aside. And I was like, oh, that's right. I forgot about that part. And how excellent that was. It's pretty funny, too. Like, it's a sign of how Dostoevsky is such great literature. Because even when you know the plot, you actually want to read it more. That actually motivates you to read it more, as opposed to, like, if you hear the plot of a Hollywood movie or something, it's like, well, now it's ruined, right? The twist is ruined. It's funny how literature can sometimes have that effect of like, oh, now you actually want to go back to it. So I really appreciate the work that you do, Trey.
Oh, thank you. So I thought, just because we're kind of in a Hegelian phase of the
Sure.
channel right now. So I'm just going to begin with Hegel. We'll see where we go. And also,
Excellent.
I've got some questions on Todd McGowan as well. I know you mentioned
Great.
him. So yeah. So I guess I just begin, very broad question. What value do you find in Hegel when you read Hegel? What stands out for you? How does he relate to your thought processes and stuff like that?
Well, that's marvelous. And, the question of Hegel is always quite fun because it also depends on who's Hegel and who are you asking. You
Right.
have a scholar over here who really likes the philosophy of right. You have someone over here that emphasizes the history, someone else over here that's going to be understanding Hegel in terms of Marxist thought and so on and so forth. So whenever we get into the conversation of Hegel, you always have different people who have different views. And that's part of the fun. You get that dialectical tension, right? Where new possibilities can emerge out of all that. Uh, a lot what's so interesting about Hegel is first off, when we look at the phenomenology of spirit, we have an understanding of where we can see consciousness is in a movement toward understanding itself as consciousness, not merely trying to understand the subjects of consciousness, say what this computer is, but also trying where the consciousness is positioning itself. It's like, what am I learning about myself and learning about this computer? So for example, this computer, I have colors, there are shapes. So consciousness is something that can understand colors and that can understand shape. And what kind of thing must consciousness be in order to take in and to comprehend colors and shapes and so on and so forth? The consciousness will also be using language by which I can communicate with you and that I can understand what you're saying. But language is so imprecise and imperfect, and it's always moving around and quite difficult. And yet that is what consciousness uses to create community, to speak with other people. Intelligibility, what kind of thing is consciousness? That is what it would use to understand the world. What kind of thing is it? Well, it seems to be something that's always trying to approach a goal, but the means by which it tries to approach that goal is one of the reasons it makes it so difficult, right? Like, you use language because you're trying to articulate something, and yet language is often the thing that you struggle to do well, to articulate it well. What a funny thing consciousness is. For me, the big moment where Hegel became extremely interesting is when I finally, and this is the part where I have to admit it was very late in life before I understood Hegel correctly. If only, if only I had the guidance of a Todd or a wonderful Cadell Last earlier in life. Because I started out very interested. I did a lot of work in like the Scottish Enlightenment, David Hume, people like Vico, people like that, and even in economics with Friedrich Hayek and so on and so forth. And I was just a silly person who understood Hegel mostly through a Marxist standpoint, which of course that's a whole debate. But when I really understood Hegel's critique of Kant, or the great inversion of Kant, that's when I went, oh, that's interesting. And if I were to summarize that quite simply, and again, I mentioned Dr. Cadell last. He has some fantastic videos explaining this, and I could mention, I'll probably allude to him 100 times because I adore Cadell last. But there's this idea where you say, oh, okay, so you've got the phenomenon, you got the noumenon, we got this line, and here we are in our brains, and across the noumenon, you get to the things in themselves, right? But we can never get to the things in themselves because we're we're stuck with the phenomenon. And that's what Kant, seemingly gives us. And here we are. What do we do? And then kind of, Hegel comes along and he's like, well, Kant, interesting. How is the noumenon for consciousness? Is not the noumenon itself an idea that consciousness would arise to? And if consciousness is, in fact, there's only one little assumption you have to grant. I tried to explain in the Absolutely Knowing Kant. All you have to do is grant that consciousness wants to know itself, that consciousness is in a movement from ignorance into intelligibility, that it is not trying to not understand. And I think there's good reason to think this. When I look at this bookcase, the first thing I naturally try to do is understand it, like say that is a bookcase. So I look at the colors. I don't say intentionally try to darken my understanding, right? Now, that doesn't mean I can't get it wrong, and I probably do get it wrong, and I can never take in I can't look at that bookcase and see every title on it or so on and so forth. But consciousness is seeking to increase its understanding, right, of itself and the world around it, at least to the degree that it can help it understand itself, like I was mentioning the laptop, as a thing that can take in colors and shapes and so on and so forth. So here's the question. All right, so Hegel's like, all right, Kant. So the noumenon is an idea that consciousness came up with itself. How is that for consciousness? How does consciousness learn about itself in coming up with the idea of the noumenon? Because what you seem to be suggesting, Kant, is that the noumenon is what keeps consciousness from getting full access. But that idea in of itself is something that consciousness would have come up to because it thinks it needs to come up with that in order to get a better understanding of the world, or to get to approach at what is actual, if you will, whatever that term means. That's pretty crazy. That pretty nutsy inversion of the noumenon is pretty nuts because one, it does a few things. One, it gives you reason to finally start, you could live all these years after watching The Matrix or these different movies, like, how do you know anything is real and so on and so forth? And you read Kant and Descartes and you're like, you're right. It's all an illusion out there. Well, when you take there's actually, the first thing I'll say that got me interested in Hegel is that if you take that idea very seriously, there's actually something quite hopeful about it, actually, and this is really needed in a meaning crisis, if we take Bernanke's term correctly. Because if you take that, it's like, you're finally like, oh, I can trust my consciousness. I can trust the way that the world is presented to me. That doesn't mean I always get it right, but I don't have to worry that it's almost like I'm not totally depraved in a sort of Calvinist sense, right? I don't have to worry about being totally depraved. The way that I take in the world, there is reason to think, because consciousness is for itself, there is reason to think that is reliable, and that based on that, I can actually make progress in intelligibility, that I am not stuck in myself. But of course, the next thing, and then I'll pass it back to you, but this is quite interesting because it's a paradoxical. The other thing, this is why I think Todd's work is so fantastic, and Goodell and so on, and Zizek, who you do wonderful work on, is that then consciousness knows itself through these strange ironies and paradoxes and the enemies, I can never say that word, of reason and so on and so forth, that the studying of these kind of strange paradoxical situation where consciousness gains reason to believe that it is for itself based on the idea of the noumenon, which is very kind of ironic and paradoxical, that these become key principles or key things to examine, key points in the life of the mind to sort of even determine how the mind develops and how the mind goes on. And do forgive me, people listening to this would be like, man, he's using mind and consciousness and self-conscious interchangeably. And it'd be like, you got to get consciousness, self-consciousness, and religion and reason and all the terms correct. So forgive me if I use some of these too interchangeably. But I think that for me was, and again, I'll just stress, there is something about that I found just very hopeful. Because it actually gives you a way to believe you can escape your head, however imperfectly. And also it opened new horizons. I did a lot in literature, like English and different things like that. And I think Harold Bloom is correct that irony and paradox are big dimensions of literary thinking and humanities thinking. So suddenly that whole field took on an entirely different meaning.
Right. And but that was brilliant. And you mentioned how you with Hegel, you sort of get this idea that you can trust consciousness in a way it can really tell us something about what is real. And I remember in one of your videos, I'm not sure if it was you or your wife, but you guys, I think it was both of you guys, you were talking about how before the photograph, there was just this sort of natural immediacy, and in the past, there was a certain immediacy. And for Hegel, this sort of immediacy is unfreedom in the sense that only with consciousness and subjectivity do we transcend immediacy and we're able to look upon ourselves as conscious beings. So I was wondering, and I know when you were talking about the sort of immediacy before the photograph, it was in the context of the meaning crisis. So I'm wondering, like, I know you guys talk about this a lot. How does Hegel, what can he say about the meaning crisis, and how can really, taking into account Hegel's project of analyzing consciousness as it becomes for itself, how could that offer some solutions or maybe even questions even concerning the meaning crisis that we're now undeniably facing?
That is such an excellent question. You need to start a business where people hire you to like frame really good questions. That is so excellent, Craig. That was marvelous. Well, in the piece, and one, if it was a good idea, it probably came from Michelle. So if I take credit for it, it's
I think it was her, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, of course it was. There's a piece called Representing Beauty, which is on the idea that before the camera is invented, there's not even the horizon, the possibility space where you look at a tree and think that could be a picture. But now, once the technology is invented, it is no longer possible to look at a tree and not, even if you don't have a camera, to think of it as a potential tree. A potential picture, right? Because it could be a picture. The technology has transformed the horizon, and the term we use is towardness. Our towardness toward things changes. Mm-hmm. Once we have inscript, I'm not saying that's necessarily bad, but it is to say that what things can be in their potentiality transforms relative to new, in that example, we'll be talking about technologies. And this, of course, would say, this then got into a discussion on the necessity of being aware of that, so you don't fall into like Heideggerian technia thinking or delusion capture or things or so on. Because what ends up happening is that you start thinking about everything in terms of being potential photographs and not even realize that way of thinking about things has been oriented by your technological state, by the state of technology today, and it does your thinking for you, per se. So to be aware of that. Well, if we take this consciousness, so the question I like to ask, like for me, it's almost like an entirely new line of inquiry that Hegel opens up, that I like to frame as the following. Like if we take the idea seriously that consciousness is for itself, like that it's trying to gain greater self-understanding, self-consciousness is the term I use. And again, I'm using it a little more broadly than Hegel is using it. Then we can ask the question, like in the ways like, how is my experience of this laptop for consciousness gaining self-consciousness? I could say, well, I learned that consciousness is something that understands the world in terms of colors and shapes and so on and so forth. Well, likewise, I can look at the comments like, so how is technology for consciousness? What is consciousness trying to learn about itself in understanding this tree now as a potential picture? Well, it's to say, one of the things you learn is that consciousness is dramatically conditioned by its technological situation, by the technology of the day, just automatically, thoughtlessly. That doesn't mean stupidly. By thoughtlessly, I mean it is something you do without even being aware that you do it. It's a kind of a given thing. So consciousness is very naturally structured by givens, and the givens tend to be very conditioned by the socioeconomic order and by the technologies that are around. Okay, well, why would consciousness want to be structured like that? Well, you start thinking, you say, well, maybe it's because consciousness wants to save energy, because it's just kind of easy to accept whatever the givens are of the socioeconomic order, right? And you say, okay, well, what kind of thing is consciousness then in order to be seeking to reduce energy? You say, well, maybe it's very linked up to the brain because the brain is a biological system and it wants to reduce energy. Maybe it's because consciousness wants to focus on more important things. Maybe consciousness is aware that since it is always going to be ultimately situated within a physical world that is going to be conditioned by its technology, that maybe it's better to kind of go along with that in different things like that. So there's a bunch of possibilities that open up when you start taking seriously the idea. You can ask different kinds of questions about what is happening in the world and how you're understanding the world and how you're conditioned by the world. Once you start asking the question, how is this for consciousness gaining self-consciousness? And that's also very important. And I guess then I'll pass it back to you, because the very act of even being aware that that the experience of the tree is framed. Oh, that's funny. Framed by the existence of the camera. If you are even asking that, then you are aware that it's occurring, and therefore you're not thoughtless anymore, right? It's no longer something you absorb. It's something that you know is happening, and then you can choose it, or you can choose to go beyond it, or you can choose to accept it. So there is a gaining of freedom here, right? That's one of the key components in Hegel. There's a gaining of freedom. But of course, since Hegel's ironic and literary in that sense, freedom is always a double-edged sword. As you get more freedom, you also get more existential tension because you know it could be different or that you're conditioned, but there's also more possibility. And so much of Hegel that's so interesting is, to put it very generally, there could be an increase of freedom while simultaneously suggesting a need to change the kind of person we are in order to handle that increase of freedom. There's a double action that's going on versus merely an increase of freedom, but no changing of the person who is gaining that freedom. So there's a double action that's really important. That is a kind of also description of the dialectic as well, like the kind of tension that never goes away, but it is also it's also a progressive tension, even if the tension itself does not never goes away, because in our minds there's no progress if the tension stays, but in Hegel there can be a tension that can drive you forward. Now, what the nature of that progress is, and that's always debated, and how that translates into a socioeconomic order and so on and so forth. But there is a tension there that once you're aware of, say, what the example of the tree, you becoming aware of that can then move you to ask greater questions and to seek greater self-understanding and so on and so forth.
Right. Yeah. This idea of conscious stuff becoming for us and how you gain freedom in that way. And you were also mentioning how it's a double-edged sword. And this reminds me of what Todd McGowan was talking about in Emancipation After Hegel. He basically, how he understands the dialectic is that, contrary to this idea that we're solving contradictions and we're moving towards the absolute, which is this position where you're absolutely free from contradiction, it's just a harmonious totality, it's actually the exact opposite. And it's actually funny that Hegel is probably, I don't know of any other philosopher who has two factions which are maybe equally as large, which literally see him in complete opposite ways.
It's pretty extraordinary.
It is, because, and I don't think we can just say it's because he's unclear, because in my opinion, like, Husserl is just as hard, if not harder, to read than Hegel. So there is really something there that McGowan talks about, how it's sort of like we don't want to confront the reality of contradiction, and that's his really his thesis, that instead of the dialectic being a progression towards some absolute in the naive sense of the term, the absolute is actually nothing more than you reaching the end of the process, because you've recognized that contradiction is intractable, it's universal, and there's no overcoming contradiction. But because we have this ability as free subjects to be conscious and to think through contradiction using reason, and that's why he emphasizes reason over the understanding, unlike Kant, who emphasized the understanding over reason. Because we have reason, we are actually able to reconcile ourselves with contradiction, and that is the absolute. And to me, this sounds a lot like, I remember, I believe it was Michelle again who mentioned how you can't solve a garden, but you manage your garden, right? So I think this idea of solving problems, and that is how you end in fascism. That is how you end in really, that's like the purest form of ideology, thinking that you can overcome contradiction in that way. But that doesn't just mean we accept contradiction as if just because when we have a statement of identity like A equals A, just because we can do the speculative turn there, that doesn't mean that A is B. So the solution there is like to reconcile with contradiction. I'm just wondering, how do you feel about this idea of reconciling with contradiction, and that, as McGowan says, contradiction is not only inescapable, it's actually the essence of movement, of thought, and of freedom.
Marvelous. That again, I'm telling you, you need to start your business where you frame things and ask questions. Like people are making millions doing consultation. It just boom, you frame. All that was magnificent. Hegel is fascinating in the fact that he inspires, the right Hegelians, the left Hegelians, so on and so forth, psychoanalysis. It would be extremely interesting to do a paper or a work that explores why exactly that is, and why Hegel is so unique in breeding all of these different schools. It could be because some, like I was saying at the beginning, some people take the philosophy of right with a different level of other people might take the phenomenology of space. Well, that's an early Hegel, the later thinker. I mean, there's a lot of moves here. Is the later thinker the more valid thinking than the early thinker? Maybe it's the early. You say, well, Zizek basically says, don't really take too much of the philosophy of history or the right, because that's where he's kind of, he's making the universities, telling them what they want to hear and so on and so on. So you don't take that. Well, I don't know. Maybe Hegel generally wanted to change his mind. This is also why, as just a little note, personally, one of the things that I think, and I could go down this rabbit hole, has hurt academia a lot is by really investing in the right interpretation. And don't get me wrong, I'm not in the direction of that hard, crazy relativism or whatever, but one of the problems with misreading is that in order to know that you're misreading, you'd have to know the right reading, which if you knew that, you wouldn't be misreading. Right. So there's always an inescapable problem. And that's where someone like, I think Harold Bloom, I mentioned him, and even Derrida, because I think Derrida himself was actually quite wise on this, even if following deconstructionists may have been different. There's something about strong misreadings, good misreadings, where it's kind of like, does this meet, is it plausible? Where you start asking that the thinker could mean that. And I think Foucault, in What is an Author, talks about modes of discourse, where you think of these thinkers as a mode of discourse to entertain a certain realm of thinking and so on and so forth. So personally, I think it is important. I think just as a little note for developing one's intellectual journey, I do think it's good to move between the academic debates, to gain from both of them, but to actually make the academic debates not become ego, like your ego and which one do you find your identity in and invest in, because that would actually be falling into the very mistake that Todd is mentioning, because then you're stable. The Marxist Hegelians are the right ones. The right Hegelians are the right ones. Well, you don't have to think about Hegel anymore. Congratulations. You're done, right? But then you don't think about Hegel anymore. Because you know what the funny thing about thinking is? Thinking is in the business of not thinking. Why do you think about something? So you can stop thinking about it. So it's kind of funny. So you have, we were talking about consciousness as for itself, but consciousness almost seems like it always, so if we use that term consciousness or mind or spirit, that's a controversy too. People debate what phenomenology of spirit should be translated into, should be spirit, blah, blah, blah. But let's just use consciousness. Well, it's kind of funny because it's almost like consciousness has to exist in a constant battle with brain. And I like to say the brain is the frenemy. So your brain is pretty biological. Your brain does not want to use energy. So yeah, it's going to think, but it wants to think so it can rest, right? So it wants to determine the right interpretation of Hegel so it can sit down and be done and just be like, I know Hegel. And it feels so good to say, I know Hegel. Man, I'm a Hegel scout. Man, I know Hegel. Your brain loves that stuff because now you get to rest. Now you get status. Now you stroke your ego, and now you can power dominate over other people. Man, your brain loves that stuff. But then that consciousness of yours that you trained with Hegel went, hey, brain, hey, you're not gaining more self-consciousness. You stop moving. You're not developing. Consciousness is supposed to be forced. So your consciousness is tapping on your brain. It's like, hey, I'm for myself and you're getting in the way. So now we're at odds. You need to overcome that tendency, brain, of seeking to rest and whatever, and get an understanding of reality that doesn't give you excuses to feel like you're rational and intellectual when you stop thinking. So one of that's as a note, that's another great thing about Hegel is it teaches you that your natural tendency to seek a resolution is problematic and is actually probably anti-self-consciousness. And it actually kind of sets you up to see a sort of dialectic between your brain and consciousness, if you will. Someone like Seth Godin talks about the lizard brain, or, where your brain is kind of very biological. So, but it's kind of funny because your brain is, your consciousness is stuck dealing with your brain because it seems to have, we can get into the mind-body problem or whatever. I don't think we have to, but there's actually something, there's like a dialectic right here between the consciousness that wants to be for itself and the consciousness and the brain that just wants to be done, Frank. It just wants to be done. So there's actually a paradox right there, right? And there's actually a kind of AB where consciousness equals brain, but doesn't equal brain, or is left hemisphere, right? You can get to the Ian Gildecrest and, things that matter and so on. So there's something very interesting. One of the things, so Hegel wants to really focus on paradox and contradiction because that's going to continue thinking. And also, if we understand the absolute as something of which the very subjectivity or subject of which is seeking it, therefore, in a way, is changed by that absolute, and the absolute itself changes in its nature and it becomes a feedback loop, then by definition, you must always be thinking because the thinking is the changing, if you will. So a strategy of the brain to find rest must be in favor of what I like to call the truth, Hegel, Wittgenstein's everything that is the case, but not in favor of the absolute, which I like to say is everything that is the case, plus you, plus you reconstituting it, plus you changing it and so on. That little spot where the map isn't the territory, where the break between the map and the territory is unveiled. That's what you have to understand is there. And the emphasis on contradiction that I think Todd is emphasizing, the emphasis on contradiction, I think is an important thing to focus on. Because what is a contradiction? I like to call it a pure thought. A contradiction, by definition, cannot exist in the world, right? There cannot be a contradiction in reality. If contradiction, it's a pure thought, right? That's kind of weird. So your brain is able to think something that doesn't have any signified, any material representation in the world. You're able to think a pure thought. That's kind of crazy. What kind of creature must we be to be able to think a pure thought, to be able to think a contradiction? For example, you're able to go down the road and you mistake a dog for a cat. You think you saw a dog, but actually you saw a cat. How are you able to make a mistake? If everything is how is your brain able to make a mistake, right? And to genuinely think that in that moment, the dog equaled the cat, right? So it has ontological implications, because if you are able to think a contradiction, which does not exist in the world, it can only be a pure idea, to use that term,
right.
Then we have to somehow be a kind of being that can think a pure idea. And so that has ontological significance, because I think, I try in the Truths of the Rational Michel now, we try to talk about how basically epistemology and ontology are always linked. Like they're always linked together. If you're able to think or use mental models, that says something about the kind of being you are. And so if we take seriously the fact that we're able to think things that cannot be materially represented in the world, then that means we are able to think pure thoughts, and that has ontological implications. And that means consciousness also is able to consider the world in ways that seems different from how the brain just takes in things. And therefore there is a kind of division, and therefore there is a kind of dialectic. So, and then I'll pass it back to you. The taking seriously the contradiction and the paradox, as opposed to, here's the thing, this is what we tend to do. We say that's a contradiction, therefore it's effaced. It doesn't matter. And you kind of push it aside, right? You say it doesn't matter. Okay, well, even if the contradiction itself effaces, you still had the idea of the contradiction. And so it is still a phenomenon that you need to take account for because your consciousness is able to consider it. So it is still relevant for understanding your ontological structure, even if the contradiction to itself was effaced. And then before I go on, so if you take that seriously, where then you are ontologically capable of pure thought, then in order to get, then we don't as human beings tend to find meaning in direction unless what we are is somehow matched, like what we think we should do with our life. If it does not somehow match with what we are, then there is a disconnect that will make it very difficult to find meaning in direction. So, you can't figure out where you want to go until you know where you are. And so figuring out if in fact, like what kind of being are we to think contradiction is going to be a very necessary step if one is to, solve the meaning crisis or define direction and meaning, things like that. And more can be said on, but that would be the first thing I would say.
Right. And I really like, it's just everywhere in those guys like McGowan, Zizek, all those guys, and Cadell as well, emphasizing that these epistemological contradictions, they say something about being. And actually, this is how McGowan at least talks about a Hegelian critique of Spinoza, who has this idea of a pure, unchanging God, right? Self-identical substance, but the very fact that we can think, right? And then he has this idea of the intellectual contemplation of God, but the very idea of having that contemplation because of what it means to be a thinking being that refutes his notion of a pure self-identical substance. You have to have a rupture in that substance in order for us to have thought itself. And but the thing is, it's not merely that. The fact that we can make an error, in my opinion, from my understanding, that also means the fact that we have error means that we also have the possibility for truth, and that without the possibility for error, there is no possibility for truth. And I was reading this essay by Georges Bataille on Hegel. It's called Hegel, Death and Sacrifice, and I'm quoting it in McGowan, my videos on McGowan's book. He talks about how you have the fly in a swarm, and the fact is, without the understanding, which is the Hegelian term for the capacity to divide yourself from the world and divide the world into entities. Without the understanding, there is no distinction between the flies, right? Because the flies, that distinction doesn't actually exist in the natural world. Distinction is not a category of the natural world. And actually, I've been Graham Harman and object-oriented ontology. Yes. So he has this idea of universalizing the Kantian gap of subject and object. And he just says, well, why don't we just say all objects are barred from each other? And my problem with that, and I'm not sure if this critique has been made, my problem with that is that he is supposedly being anthropocentric, anthropomorphic, right? And but the fact is, in order to have this idea of distinct objects in the world, you already need the understanding. So what he's doing is, in fact, he's universalizing the understanding in the natural world. And I don't think Hegel does. Well, Hegel doesn't do that. He shows how really without the understanding, you don't have the separate entities, and really you don't even have truth, because even though error comes into the world with consciousness, that is also the possibility of truth. And that's really what Hegel is getting at. And that would be his critique of Kant, who, when he stops at the understanding and doesn't go into reason, because reason is what thinks through contradictions. And of course, there's the Kantian antinomies. For Hegel, that's not an issue. That's just proof of reason's power to think through these contradictions. And I'm not sure where I was going here, but maybe just what are your thoughts on that? Yes.
That was all magnificent. Goodness, before I forget, I did want to add, when you're talking about the meaning prize, if we take seriously the idea in Hegel, and I make a distinction, I like to talk about negation versus effacement, where negation can be part of the sublative arc, where you get the abstract, negative, concrete, or you can have the sublation, where you have a loss, but that makes possible something new. So, for example, I lose my roof, but that makes possible the idea of a glass roof or a new roof, right? There's a loss, but every loss comes with a possible gain. But if I just get hopeless and say, well, the next storm's going to just take out the roof, why do anything? And I just leave it open. Well, then it's an effacement. I've lost the roof. There's nothing new that comes with it. So there's a negation versus a sublation. So I wanted to add, Hegel will also, we're in this quote unquote meaning crisis. If we understand that the meaning crisis is a result of us, it's not actually that we don't know how to solve the meaning crisis. We know how to solve it. Fascism, racism, xenophobia, closed-minded. We have a lot of solutions. The issue is that we've decided that none of those solutions are ones we're going to accept anymore. We're holding ourselves up to a higher standard. Some people aren't, which is bad. We all know that's bad. Conspiracies, all that different thing. But it's more like the meaning crisis is a result of, if we think someone like a Thomas More, who simply ends up in prison. He could get out of prison anytime, just grant the king the divorce, right? And the man of all seasons or whatever, but he will not do it. He knows how to get out of prison, but he won't do it. We need to think of the meaning crisis as something that is self-imposed, something that we are doing to ourselves, precisely because we want it to be it's a negative space. It's a space of negativity that makes possible something new that we're forcing upon ourselves because we don't want to fall back on previous solutions to the meaning crisis, because every society has had a problem with meaning, just like they've had a problem with food and shelter and thirst and whatever. They just solved it with ways we don't want to use anymore because they're violent and bad. We don't want to do them. I think that's really important, because otherwise we think of the meaning crisis as some room you stumbled into on accident and the door locked behind you and you don't know how to get out, and oh my gosh, it's a dead end. What are we going to do? But if you think instead of the meaning crisis is self-imposed for the sake of higher standards, it can give you hope. It can give you hope and to see it as a sort of process of consciousness, trying to gain higher self-consciousness according to higher moral standards that consciousness has unveiled to itself as needing to figure out how to implement. Now, what exactly does that look like? And that's the whole quote unquote conversation and so on and so forth. What you were saying about difference, so on and so forth, and also what you were saying about error as the knowing of truth. It brings to mind the point that you brought up in your wonderful video on the wired brain with Zizek on this idea that in the singularity, this could be a problem because actually the infinity of language is precisely the process of struggling to find the right words. If you just knew the right words, the language would be terrible. The creative aspect of language precisely becomes from the error. Because what is an error? Like what would it look like to have no possibility of mistake? Zero. That would necessitate that the logic, if you will, that reality followed was linear. It would have to be a one-to-one kind of relationship where the word cat equaled the thing cat. Where does creation come from? Where does newness come from? It comes from improvisation. So a world where there is no possibility of error is also a world where there's no possibility of improvisation, of something new. And if there's no possibility of something new, well, the funny thing about time is it seems to be that the moment, I'm new in a sense, like the moment between each moment is new relative to the next. The constant now, if you will, is defined by a perpetual newness. Well, if there is no error and there could therefore be no creation or improvisation, that would suggest there could be no newness. And if there could be no newness, we might all be effaced. We all might just be dead. So this is also why, it's kind of important as well. Like if you're talking about like an Austin Farah and who was good friends with Mr. Lewis, who I know you did the Space Trilogy and the Great Divorce. He had this kind of idea that the infinite. It's really kind of a funny idea where he kind of asked the question where, people get upset. They're like, why didn't God just make humans infinite, right? Why did he make them finite? And it's like, well, because the infinite didn't exist until after the finite was created. Is that God, in making the finite, created the infinite. So of course he couldn't just make it. And the reason for that is because when you say, well, wait a minute, isn't like God infinite? No, God is himself. And infinity is a salient dimension of finitude, or it's an orientation of finitude. God, infinity to God is just an attribute of God, right? When you start talking about it as like an ontological state, which would be a gaining of that attribute, well, that's a sort of transformation that then would require a role of time. And also, quite importantly, if God just made other gods, well, then there, by definition, there can only be one God. So if God made other gods, it would like be a suicidal act or something like that, right? So there had to be a differentiating principle if God created human beings, and that would be the relationship of the finite and the infinite, of which is then broken apart from God's just pure being into a relationship of attributes. That then means the finite creates the infinite as opposed to the finite come out of the infinite. So you get a transformation. So error and development. Another way to put this is there has to be process, right? There has to be like a process, a movement of error to truth. Like if you knew all of truth, and if there's no process, there's also no life. Like if there's not a development, there isn't life. So it actually, in some respects, comes to the question of if we continue to think about this in a theological framework, and you got Ivan Karmosov who's angry that God made freedom or so on and so forth. Things like, well, why did he give us freedom? Because we just use that to cause suffering and so on and so forth. If human beings are going to be free, and that means there be creative possibilities, then there has to be the possibility of error, because error is always relative to an intention, right? Like error, in a sense, there's no errors in reality, like in the world to itself. The world is just what it is, right? There's no errors, there's just isness. Error is a disconnect between what you think should be the case and what is actually the case, right? And so error has to exist if there's the possibility of the mind, consciousness, considering the world differently than the world is to itself, right? That error is a necessary possibility. So there has to be error, the possibility of error for the possibility of change, for the possibility of development, for the world to be something more than what it is. Or another way to put this is the distinction between causality and creation. Causality is just say, the billiard ball rolls across the table and so on and so forth. Where creation is, I see a billiard ball rolling across the table and I say, you know what? It would be really neat if I were to divide, maybe have a big alley and I put these pins up, and the idea of seeing balls, now you've invented bowling. Because you saw the causation of the billiard balls, you now have the idea of bowling, which you then go out and invent, which causation on its own would have never given you a freaking bowling alley. You would have the ocean hitting rocks would have never given you a bowling alley. But the experience of causality could then result in the human being creating the bowling alley. But the possibility of creating a bowling alley is only possible if it's possible for me to make a game that's bad. Like I have a bad idea of seeing the billiard balls. I gotta be like, I see the billiard balls, hey, it'd be fun if I were to put my, if I were to take these big balls and throw them at my little brother. That would be a fun game too. No, that's a bad game, right? But there has to be the possibility of also creating something not so good in order to create something new. So error error is a necessary possibility if there is to be a meaningful distinction between causation and creation. If there is no possibility of error, and this, and I haven't touched on similarity and difference, but I want to hand it back to you because you always, because what you say is always so magnificent, is that there has to be a possibility of error for there to be a meaningful distinction between causation and creation. And critically, the development of consciousness towards self-consciousness in Hegel is deeply more connected to creation, creative acts, than it is causation. Causation and understandings of causation is lower on what Cadell last calls the phenomenological journey, and yet necessary, like totally necessary. But it's only a part. Once you understand causation, then you understand how causation helps, consciousness understand itself, and then you start thinking in terms of what does it mean that consciousness is capable of creation, of experiencing the billiard balls and coming up with bowling. How is that for content? What does that say about consciousness, and then so on and so forth.
Right. Okay, that was brilliant. And when you mentioned that the infinite doesn't create the finite, but the finite creates the infinite, that's exactly what Hegel says. Because when you have just the natural objects, they are finite, and when they are confronted with their limit, they die. The tree, when it's confronted with really strong storm, it dies. But what happens with self-consciousness is, out of the finite, you get the infinite, because self-consciousness, it knows its own limits. And in this way, it transcends them. Because if you think about it, let's just say you have your limit and then you have you, and if you know your limit, you're outside of your limit already. So and it's that ability to transcend your own limits, which for Hegel is the infinity of spirit or self-consciousness, whatever you want to call it. And I want to return to the meaning crisis, when as you mentioned, there's all the 20th century, we could say it's after Nietzsche proclaimed the death of God, that God is dead. So we have all these projects which are attempting to replace God, and like fascism, like Stalinism, whatever it is. We could even say that in our societies, money took that idea of like Great Gatsby and stuff. So like really what McGowan talks about is that whenever you have these ideas like the nation, just the nation, which is an idea, but there is no nation really, like, or you have the perfect state, it goes all the way back to Plato, but you also have it in fascism. And if we just got rid of the communists, if we just got rid of the Jews, we'd have the perfect state. This idea is, for McGowan, it's substance. Just like God is substance, at least a traditional God, the monotheistic God, for McGowan, that's not the Christian God. And that's why he, just like Hegel, is he doesn't consider himself a Christian, but he's like an atheist Christian, as Zizek calls himself. And the idea is that you need to imagine that substance is subject. Right. If we understand that subject is what is continuously negating itself, it doesn't have a solid self-identity, because the moment you start thinking self-identity, that's when you are open to ideas like the perfect state. And we have the perfect state in fascism. We have an ideal future in Marxism. And this is why, even if you want to argue that Marxism was a good idea, or a communist idea is a good idea, the idea, it's the irony is that good idea is what was the justification for the mass murder, starvation of millions, right? So and you have the phenomenologist Merleau-Ponty. He even says this in an essay. He even says that, well, the Stalinism will be justified if it works. Well, it didn't work, but still, if you're imagining, if you truly take the Hegelian insight, if you internalize that, you can't say, well, if it comes about, because it's never going to come about, because substance is subject. There is no pure self-identity, and any idea of something like an other in that sense, like an other, like a big other, and afterwards we can get into an actual reconciling with otherness, but this is not the other we're talking about. When we're talking about the big other, we're talking about ideas like the state, and an idea of someone who is free from contradiction, and you answer to. That is how you open up all the pathways to the horrors of the 20th century, which far outweigh the horrors of the Crusades or anything like that. So what's your view on that?
A few things. When you come up to people and you say, well, are you perfect? They would go, well, of course not. Nobody's perfect. Like, everyone knows that nobody's perfect. We all make mistakes. And yet there are like perfect systems and perfect ideologies. But if you take quite seriously that substance equals subject, that phrase, then, and if we associate ideologies as being sort of a substance, an intellectual substance, I like to call them internally consistent system, like a system or different things, we'll just say. Well, then we should not expect any system to always work under all conditions in every possible way. There's this issue to, there's a great book that, it's a great book because nobody reads it, by a man named Leopold Koh. It's called The Breakdown of Nations. And, he talks a lot about how we think a lot in terms of left and right. We really also need to think about ups and downs, because the point he wants to make is that basically any system can work on small enough of a scale. You can absolutely make Marxism work if you have like 10 people who all agree in Marxism and they live in a community and they all get along. Of course it will work. The problem is scale. It's basically always scale. Like, for example, capitalism works great until you necessarily get businesses that can equal a certain corporate state and size, that they become, say, too big to fail, and they can't fail without taking down the entire system systematically. And that's very problematic, because in capitalism works. This is very general, because self-regulation and self-interest go together. Like, for example, if I mistreat my customers, they won't buy from me. So therefore, I need to self-regulate. I need to be nice to them, because if they don't like me, I won't make money. So self-regulation and self-interest goes together. But if it's possible in capitalism for entities to become invincible, too big to fail, then the link between self-interest and self-regulation is separated. And I no longer have to self-regulate in order to gain self-interest. So on large enough of a scale, a business, something like that is more free market that may work on a certain scale, may not work as much. It may become, as I love Alex Ebert's language, he talks about cancerous, where it can become something good, can become cancerous, because what is the result of a cancer cell? Cancer is a result of cells that don't want to die, right? They don't know when to die. They don't know when to regulate themselves, per se. So there's this idea that lots of things can work. Lots of things work on small enough of a scale, but then when they get bigger, they may not work as well, because things are imperfect, right? But here's the problem. Since ideas can, in fact, work on small enough of a scale, and they also, there's no necessary reason why Marxism has to fail. If people just did what they were supposed to do and so on and so, it's not necessarily the case that capitalism has to give rise to too big to fail entities. There's no or become a mixed market instead of a free market. There's no reason it has to. Well, because there's no reason it has to, it becomes very easy to then say, well, then let's try it on a bigger scale and then let's rise it. But here's the thing. If you don't take seriously that ideologies are subject equal substance, and therefore the mechanisms of ideologies being used are going to be like the human mind, which is full of self-deception, rationalization, avoiding evidence in its favor, and so on and so forth, then when the evidence start coming in that you're, like they talk about in the Red Tsar, I think, the mass, like you mentioned, the mass starvations with the Cossacks, I think, in parts of Russia or different things, you're going to be, you got to break a few eggs to make an omelet. That's okay. It's all going to be worth it. in the end. In the same way that if, say, you're having problems in your marriage and you're not being very nice, you say, well, next week we'll figure it out. Yeah, this will be okay in the morning. And you never do anything to change, and so on and so forth. So the point I'm getting at, because also too, if you look at yourself, if you gain too much money, let's use that idea of scale. You gain too much scale, you get too much money or you get too much status. If you pay attention to yourself, don't you start becoming egotistical? Don't you start becoming kind of a jerk or materialistic? Don't your values get all mixed up and different things like that? Tends to. Most people, fame can be a problem. It can destroy people and different things like that. Mm-hmm. So one of the things I want to note is that if you really take seriously the idea that substance equals subject, then you start thinking about ideologies as being prone to the same tendencies as the human subject is. It works both ways in a sense. And that will keep you from believing in these perfect systems, because there's no perfect people. And if there's no perfect people, there are no perfect systems. And so the name of the game then becomes a system in the same way that one of the names of the games for the human is to learn how to rise to the occasion of whatever life may throw at you, and accordingly adapt and improv and change your ways. Likewise, you want to make a system that simultaneously will also admit its errors, change its ways, be able to fail, but not on a systemic way. The entire way you think about systems radically change. But in order to do that, you have to accept a very difficult level of humility and active thinking. Because a system, like a perfect system, the idea is set it and forget it. Oh man, we made capitalism, set it and forget it. It's going to work out. It's all going to be great. But Hegel's like, no, because there is no perfect system. You have to actively check and balance it and make sure that it works and it's not getting to too large of a scale. So if you take Hegel seriously, and I did want to mention stuff on the similarity and difference because that gets into Leibniz and sameness and so on. So the thing is with it in the same way that there is no such thing as a perfect system. That's actually what Cadell and I will talk about being an effacement or a depth drive. It's like a Freudian depth drive. You want to return to the womb, get the oneness. Likewise, you get the perfect system where everyone is one and happy and everything works smoothly. It's all kind of a Freudian depth drive in a way, an AA effacement. In the same way, we have a tendency to seek sameness, where everything is the same, because that's existentially comforting. We're all capitalists, we're all communists. Or what's happening now in an almost Deleuzian spirit is everyone wants to be purely different and can only be understood as themselves. But if there's pure difference, there's no relation because everything is too different to understand one another. But then the funny thing is, if everyone's the same, well, then everyone's dead because there's no sameness in nature, in a sense. There's similarity, but there's no absolute sameness. Sameness equals effacement. So in a desire for oneness, on a systems level where everything works out and it's all one and unified, is likewise a desire for sameness, which can be an effacement, or you can have an opposite reaction into a pure difference that destroys relations, and then people can't connect. And that's arguably one of the big characteristics of the meaning crisis, right? You don't have community, people don't have any givens, they don't share anything, just so on and so forth. Everything is a mixture, and everything is a mixture of similarity and difference. Because wherever there is similarity, there also has to be difference, because if there wasn't difference, there would be sameness. They'd be the same. So if there is similarity, there is also difference. But if there's difference, there also has to be similarity, because if there wasn't, it would be pure difference. And therefore, it wouldn't just be different. It would be pure different, like over here. I find it very interesting in the English language. There's no term that means like pure different in that sameness means pure similarity. You have sameness, similarity, but then you only have difference. You almost need a fourth term there. That's like a pure difference in the same way that sameness is pure similarity. So identity, this is my point. Identity and thinking is always operating in a movement of similarity and difference, which is funny because that means things are known by a process that is at war with itself. It's trying to gain more similarity, but that means it's getting less difference, which means it's losing its similarity towards sameness, and then vice versa, and so on and so forth. So the very way knowledge is gained or things are identified is in of itself a tension, a dialectical development of sameness and difference that all things hold in of themselves. And to close, and then I'll hand it back to you, the problem with, say, these ideological systems is you're looking for pure sameness or pure oneness, as opposed to a system that makes space for a continual process of similarity and difference working itself out dialectically. As consciousness needs to realize that's how it knows things so that it doesn't unintentionally seek a death wish, a death drive, a oneness, or an essential difference that kills community. Consciousness needs to recognize itself as understanding the world in terms of a dialectic between similarity and difference, so that it actually learns and doesn't fall into death drives, and so that it does not fall into the temptation of trying to create ideological structures that are actually, dreams of a return to the womb in disguise.
Right. Right. Yeah, I don't have much to say on that. I think that can stand on its own. I will just mention that on the top, I'm talking about specifically on sameness and difference. When you say that sameness is you didn't say it was nothing, I don't think, but that's what I was gonna say is when you have pure sameness, that simply means you have no there's no determinate qualities to it, because exactly. It's all same. And for that's Hegel, right. Hegel, that is pure being, which in the beginning of the science of logic, that is pure nothing. So sameness really is nothing. And you mentioned how just go back to how there is no perfect system. I wanted to mention that there may be some people who have heard some misreadings of Hegel, possibly from their college professors, but if they've studied philosophy, that's very likely. That you're saying that we're talking about Hegel here, and you're saying that well, there is no perfect system. I feel like we have to mention that a lot of people think that this is what Hegel believed. Like, I believe that's what Bertrand Russell says. I know the guy who but wrote the first book on postmodernism, Leotard, he said that Hegel, Adorno as well, he was great. Like, Adorno's like, oh yeah, his dialectical method, it's great. But then you have this idea of the absolute and the totality. But if you understand it in Zizek's way, in Todd McGowan's way, absolute just means you're the final moment, because you've recognized that there is no overcoming. I think for Zizek, it would be no overcoming negativity. For McGowan, no overcoming contradiction. And I was just going to say that this idea of having a perfect system, you're completely correct. You have to relate it to the subjects who create that system. And the only reason why Plato was able to conceive of a republic that was perfect, and this is even what he says, is because it's ran by a philosopher who is a pure, the philosopher king is a subject who is completely without contradiction, because he has attained to the knowledge of the pure forms. He's not dealing with all of the appearances. He's not determined by the sensible objects in the world. So the only way you can ever have this idea of a perfect system is if you have a perfect subject. And that's why perhaps the most famous idea of a perfect system, Plato's Republic, needed a perfect subject. But if you understand subject in the way Hegel does, and if you understand substance as subject, you realize that there is no perfect system. And I think maybe you can comment on that, but maybe to change the topic a bit, it's related. You made a video talking about why democracy is likely doomed, and you're relating it to game theory, and that was really fascinating. And I was wondering if you could go into the why is democracy doomed?
Well, because we don't have Plato's philosopher king, man. Once we get that, we're going to be set. We just got to go find that cave, pull him out, make him do it. It'll be fine. Few things. Marvelous. I think, when it comes to the idea that the word perfect is kind of funny, right? Like, what does it mean, the word perfect mean? Does it mean the perfect pen, one that will always have ink in it and never break, and that if you throw across the room will not make a mark on your wall because it will always pluck back in? What does perfect mean? Aquinas and had that thought where he said, your thumb is perfect if it works, where perfection is always tied to working. So, for example, your hand is a telos, a point, telos bound, a point of the hand is to pick up the pen. Mm-hmm. Therefore, your hand is perfect because it is holding the pen, right? Mm-hmm. So perfection is relative to point and task, or what it is for, and so on and so forth. That's more Aristotelian, obviously. And it's also kind of the idea that any other language of perfect is kind of just an argument of salience or something, right? Where you say this hand is prettier. I mean, it's kind of weird. Like, what would even perfect mean? Like it's the best at gripping a hand? Okay, well then perfection is tied to task, right? So when we talk about Hegel making the perfect system, if we're talking about a system that never fails, well, no, that is not what Hegel is talking about. But he is talking about, with the absolute knowing, a state of which failure would be integrated into it in such a manner that that would be part of the functioning. And therefore is perfect in so much as the failure is integrated into it. The error is part of the process, just like we were saying earlier. If that's what we mean by perfect, well, yeah, of course, that's Hegel's goal. He's trying to make the perfect system that functions, taking seriously the fact that the subject equals the substance. This is what it would do, and it is perfect in so much it is perfect in so much as it is taking seriously that ontological reality, and then making it toward the task that needs to do, so that consciousness can be for itself in such a manner that it best integrates itself with absolute knowing, and so on and so forth. So it depends on what one means by perfect. If by perfect we mean a system that never fails, no. Arguably, Hegel's almost doing something better. He's doing something that makes the failure a feature of the function, which is much more interesting per se. Because again, if we go back earlier to saying that failure and error is necessary for creation, well, then the system is a creative system per se. It is perfect because it is creative. But then, of course, the word perfect has to have a different function, because you can only have perfection comparatively. And if you don't know what's going to be created, you can't call it perfect because you don't know what's going to be created in the sense of comparison. You can only call it perfect in the sense of the creative active is occurring. The function is being realized, and therefore it is perfect because a creative act is occurring, of which is known on the level of the subject in its relation to absolute knowing, and to coming to terms with its very finitude and limitness, that's not a term, being the necessary condition for the infinite, or the movement, or the infinity of the creative act, or the continual unfolding. And this is very similar to, if we go back to Christian theology on the idea. And I think Christian theology is fascinating because we're talking about similarity and difference. That's why the Trinity, I know the space trilogy, the dance at the end, Augustine, three essence, one essence, three persons. There's this fascinating idea that God has to entail a kind of difference that is not a essential difference, that there's a difference between persons, but there's a harmony in the dance. So there's a similarity, but there's also a difference, and which is quite a fascinating conception. Well, in the same way, there has to be a way that the individual person, all moments of me through time are bound in a sense by the same essence of whatever the reference point is, that is Daniel, and yet the moment of tomorrow and the day after that and the day after that does not equal all together. Like if you added them all together, you would not get my essence per se, because the essence is always in excess of the total sum of those points put together. And yet those points in time all put together do in fact unveil something about that essence, but it's never complete. It's never the total map. The other language to use, so with the meaning, the other language to use is Hegel is very interested in a system that takes seriously the fact that the map isn't the territory, right? If we use that sort of language, and that's the idea that my idea of the pen is never equal to the object of the pen. The map is never the territory. And, the one that's also tempting to bring in that I probably won't be able to help myself and do would be Kurt Gödel with the incompleteness and so on and so forth. But to I guess I was thinking about, as you were talking on this idea that in the absolute, it's the acceptance that the map is not the territory, and actually seeing that as a positivity. Like it's kind of negative, like, oh, shoot, the map isn't the territory. Crap, we're doomed. Hegel wants you to see that as actually the possibility of a new creative space. That is as actually a good thing, right? So for example, here's my sticky notes that I've written down a bunch of things because you said a bunch of smart things. So the sticky note, and I've enjoyed it, and I'm going to write a paper. So here's my sticky notes, and I look at this and I go, my idea of these sticky notes are never equal to the sticky notes. I have two choices. I either go, well, that's terrible, and then I give up and I throw down my sticky notes. Or I go, because my idea of this is not bound to the object, I have the possibility of imagining a smiley face on it. So I was able to draw a smiley face because the map wasn't the territory, right? So because there was a divide between my idea of what the thing was and what it is, I could imagine it differently. I could draw a smiley face on it. And now this world that we live in is a place where this has a smiley face. This smiley face about 5 minutes ago did not exist. And now we are in a world where this smiley fist exists. And this was only possible because the map did not equal the territory. And I was able to create because I am not purely bound by causality. And simply because I saw the divide as an opportunity for a creative act, as opposed to a space of despair, I was able to make the smiley face. Because of the noumenon, because there is a divide between me and the thing, I am able to treat the thing and create with it. If there was no noumenon, there would be no creation. And so the very split of things that they are in themselves and me is then for consciousness to exercise its uniqueness and its creativity. That divide is for consciousness because then it makes it possible for me to create and not be bound by causation. And the state of absolute knowing is where you revel and are glad of this.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I was wondering, to reach absolute knowing, when you've kind of internalized this limitation of yourself, for me, not for me, for Hegel, that is on the path to the absolute. What you're doing is you are one of the things you're doing is you're recognizing that whatever lack you have inside internal to you, that lack is, the lack in the other, you see that lack also in you. So substance is subject, right? And that in that way, that really opens up the path to forgiveness, because you can forgive the other, because that same evil that you see in the other and you're blaming the other, that exact same evil is in you. And so really you have to understand the universality of lack. And of course, no one talks about this better and more than Dr. Cadell. And so we can all have our positive differences, right? But we're all united in our being internally self-divided. And as you said, for all of us, the map is distinct from the territory, or is not the territory. And so this is how, just to relate this to what I've talked about on my channel with the agony of Eros, Byung-Chul Han, talking about the narcissistic self who tries to subsume everything within itself and tries to subsume the other. And in this way, it negates the other. There's no room for otherness. So because there's no room for otherness, there's no room for love or forgiveness. And that actually reminds me of Hegel critiquing some interpretations of the words of Jesus Christ, who said that you have to love your neighbor as yourself. And Hegel said, well, the way it's understood by the majority of people is not, for him, it's nonsensical, because how can you love yourself? There's only love in relation to an other, right? And that's why if you're going to have self-love, it's going to be some form of idolatry, because you're setting a false idea of yourself up and you're loving that as if it were the other. And also this relates to just Christianity in general, the idea of communion, of like the communion is, when we talk about communion, not just taking the Eucharist, we're talking about communion with other people, community in the Holy Spirit, that is always extending outwards towards each other and bringing people in as well in this act of, there's a Saint Dionysius the Areopagite. He's a early Christian monk. He said that there's always an act of procession and reversion. And so you extend outwards, it returns. And if you're only extending towards, if you're only going towards, and that's what you have with the narcissistic self, that is actually how, to tie it in with Lewis, that's how he describes the state of hell in The Great Divorce. It's being obsessed with yourself and turning inwards, and you only have a finite amount of self. Like, you are very small compared to all the otherness out there. And so if you're trying to subsume everything, you're making the world very small. Also, this point of identity, that the self-relating point that is has no otherness. This is what Hegel calls the night of the world. And that is described, he describes it in very hellish terms. So just like C.S. Lewis. So I see like a connection there. And just to remind you about the question I asked, I'm only saying this because I commented under the video on democracy being doomed. And I remember commenting about this stuff, talking about Byung-Chul Han and the narcissistic self. So maybe you could talk about that and then maybe tie it into the democracy stuff, because I really want the audience to hear you talk about that.
You're magnificent. I did not see your YouTube has been deleting all these comments that people post.
Well, it wasn't. It was under. It was my personal, so it would have been Traden. No profile picture. It wasn't Telos bound.
Well, I didn't mean for you to reveal your secret identity. Or
no, it's fine. It's fine.
Now, YouTube, I'll tell you what, like all these comments are vanishing. People are like, why'd you delete my comment? I'm like, I didn't. I'm so sorry. Yeah. A few things. What's very interesting on the idea that love the neighbor as yourself. Most of the neighbors are trying to kill the Jews. So, neighbors that, we hear the word neighbor and we're thinking like, oh, you're suburbia, the person who like you're kind of friendly with. It's very important to remember that neighbors are like people who want to kill you, that really hate you. And there's also something interesting to this idea, like love yourself as you love your neighbor. Well, your neighbor is in this kind of act that's trying to destroy you. So there can be something about that where you're killing your own ego to yourself. And also it's an interesting idea because it's like you love yourself through your neighbor. Like as you love yourself, you also love the neighbor. So there's also a kind of double informing there. So the kind of structure of the phrase is quite important. Now, obviously the golden rule we all know is basically, treat others as you want to treat yourself. But there are various ways it is quite important in the the Second Testament, New Testament, to always be thinking in terms of, neighbor equals like they're the other nations. They are trying to kill you. That it's very intense. It's not necessarily friendly, and that kind of ups the ante a little bit. A few things. On the idea of democracy, so on the paper with the game theory, it's going to talk about what is your metric for determining what is a good conversation? Like, what is your metric? If everyone has a metric where the point of a conversation is to be right, as opposed to determine what is right, well, then there's very different strategies one would use in order to achieve that goal. So, for example, I'm going to use the dominant strategy of not letting you talk and just forcing you to listen to me, because then I will be right. But then you will simultaneously do the same thing, right? Because you want to be right.
And that's exactly what we saw with the 2020 election debates between Biden and Trump. It's exactly what we're not America's bright points, I'll tell you. It was not Lincoln and it was not Douglas. But so, the problem is you end up in that situation when you have the wrong metrics, you get a Nash equilibrium. And a Nash equilibrium is a situation where if everyone does what is rational, you get a suboptimal result. It's a situation where if everyone is rational, then you get a suboptimal result. So in a situation where you have the wrong metric, being right as opposed to determining what is right, then what constitutes being rational is that of which leads to conversation not working or people not determining what is best, but instead just stroking their own ego. But that will be rational because you have the wrong metric. This is also, so if that metric doesn't change, and hopefully the paper and the talk elaborates on this, if that doesn't change, then yeah, democracy is doomed, because everyone's going to be implementing a dominant strategy relative to what is defined as rational, and that's going to give you a widespread Nash equilibrium that is going to give you a suboptimal result. But of course, the only way so basically what you have to do, what did I say? You have to change your metric to determine what is best. Well, one, you have to believe that you can even determine what is best. Two, you have to believe that there is something that exists. And you're not going to do any of that if you've been reading Kant all your life through Kant and thinking there's a noumenon and you're stuck in perception and stuff, that there is no truth. Like, you have to believe that the human being can somehow get closer to something better, which that's another reason why Hegel can be very important. If you take seriously the idea that consciousness is for itself and therefore reliable, there is reason to think that what it presents itself with is actually something that can progress, because if the subject equals the substance, then there's not a hard divide, and the subject is participating in the making of the subject and can influence it, and therefore is not hard divided, then yes, we can change our metric for what constitutes a good democratic discussion, and we can escape Nash equilibriums in a similar way. That because what the key idea. So first off, we need Hegel to save democracy. Okay, good. Consciousness for itself. Two, we have to change our metric of what is conversation. Otherwise, we're going to be stuck in Nash equilibriums. Because also, too, a democracy
democracy advances, not necessarily, like we use the phrase that debate, democratic debate, right? We talk about debate. All right, well, what's your metric of a debate? Like some side wins and some side loses. This is very problematic if democracy is all about debate, because it's possible that you have a winner in a debate and both people are wrong. Just because somebody won does not mean like it's right. Like there's no guarantee that truth emerges out of a debate, and worse yet, if people have not been trained to think they can know truth, they wouldn't even recognize it if the debate gave you a faulty result, right? So you have to change the entire way of thinking of people's democracy from, to put it very generally, and Michelle and I did a discussion on this today, from debate to discussion, where discussion is trying to climb a mountain per se, so that you can get to the top. Because here's the other funny thing. You actually can't have a meaningful disagreement until you understand the other person. Like you're just disagreeing with your impressions until you fully understand them. So real disagreement requires a whole lot of empathy, like trying to enter a person's system and thinking about it, right? Because then you can really, so you can't have real disagreement unless you have a lot of understanding. It almost sounds like I is other. It almost sounds like you have to really take seriously the other person as in order to even begin having a meaningful democracy. So the other thing I want to point out is that if you take seriously the ontology and the epistemology that we are presenting within this context regarding Hegel, that will radically transform what you believe is true and what you believe is the metric of the goal of a system. That will change what is rational. And that will also transform how the society organizes itself to possibly escape Nash equilibriums that otherwise it would not escape, that will give you suboptimal results. People participate in democracy relative to how they define themselves and relative to what they think constitutes thinking. And if they don't have a Hegelian understanding of their identity or I as other or absolute knowing, then the way democracy unfolds will be quite different. And it ultimately will likely probably end up being susceptible to AA thinking, which of course it is. Once we get our party and, once the Republicans come to office, then the country will be saved. Well, that's just AA, the perfect system. You're coming back to what we said earlier. Once the Democrats win, then everything will be good. Democracy now basically is just power, because what else is there? Because if the name of the game is to be right as to determine what is right, that's power. That's just a dominant strategy. That's all there can be. So if you don't get the right metrics, which I think can only be determined within everything that we've been describing, then democracy is doomed because all it will be is power.
Right. Well, we've been going for longer than an hour now. And
that's great. We gotta get to C.S. Lewis and stuff.
Oh, true. Maybe we didn't mention him, but well, I guess we can end. I was gonna be like, well, democracy is doomed. Good night, everyone. We do need to talk about Lewis, and maybe.
But I also don't want to keep you up all night because you're such a delightful conversation.
No, this is great, and I can definitely go for another 10-15 minutes. So
sure.
we're good.
Excellent.
And let's see. Well, maybe just.
Well, I wanted to interrupt you because I'm really good at interrupting people. I think it is really important, Lewis, when you talk about the Great Divorce and different things. In the Great Divorce, if I recall, at one point they talk about hell as being like a dust ball. It's this really small thing, and yet to the people in them, it's everything, right? It's like it's all, and also really important in Lewis. I always think about Lewis. Lewis was part of that generation, just like Chesterton and Oxford, where elegance and thinking were very strongly connected. It's just extraordinary. But what's so interesting in Lewis, in the Great Divorce, this is a big generality, but people's situation is often a result of a disorder. Like, Augustine says that basically all evil is a disordered good. That there's nothing wrong with sex, but there's something wrong with lust. There's nothing wrong with food, but there's something wrong with gluttony, a disordered relationship. That evil emerges from a disordered relationship. That note relation is really important because we've been talking about Hegel this entire time and certain relationships and things like that, the relation of I to the other and different things. And also too, like you have in Dante, and it's also in kind of C.S. Lewis, this idea that love, like parents' love for their children can be precisely why they end up damned. And that, the famous line that hell is locked from the inside, right? That there are these sort of you can come out of hell anytime. You just don't, because you have a disordered relationship. You have a disordered. What I think, and I think it's one of the things I always liked about Lewis is that so much of the problems are a result of an internally consistent logic that's just separated from truth. But relative to the logic, it's all sound. You know, everything that's being said, like the monkey at the end of the Chronicles of Narnia, every argument the monkey uses against ants, yeah, it works really well. You just have to know it's wrong. You know, the best book I read it a long time ago, but I'd always, Till We Have Faces, I recall being a masterpiece. And of course, there's the end of the space trilogy. But one of the things that's really important in Lewis is that in that story of Till We Have Faces, I think it's Psyche and Orla. You know, Psyche, there's this big famine, and Psyche has to be sacrificed to the gods to save the gods, and Orla is devastated because it's the sister and different things like that. And so Psyche is put on a tree, and Orla is devastated. But she goes back to the tree later and sees that Psyche's still alive. And she's so thrilled. She's like, "Oh my gosh, you're still alive!" And Psyche looks great, and she's like, "You've been tied to this tree for a really long time. What's up?" And Psyche's like, "Well, I'm married to God." And you're like, "What?" It's like, "Yes, we're in the palace right now." And you're like, "What are you talking about?" It's like, "Yes, you know." And Orla's like, you know, cis and loves her sister. And she's like, "You know, it's about to rain. We need to get going." He's like, "We don't have to worry about the rain because we're under roof." And Orla's looking around. It's like, "What are you talking about?" It starts to rain. Psyche's just sitting in the rain talking about her husband and different things like that. So basically, Psyche is looks like she's crazy, right? That she's completely insane. And Orla has every reason to think that Psyche is nuts, right? But Psyche's like, and Psyche starts talking about her husband, and she says, you know, he says, "I can't see his face, you know, that he's always in darkness. I can't see him entirely, and that there's good reason for it." And Orla's like, "Well, that's creepy and that's terrible." And Psyche's like, "Look, there's good reason for it. I just got to trust and believe." And Orla's like, "No, you got to take that mask off and see what's going on." And Psyche's like, "No, I won't do it because that's like my husband has forbid me from doing that." And Orla's like, "You got to do it." But nothing that Orla comes up with a lot of reasons that are really good. And Psyche has no answer, like basically, because everything Orla is saying is like legit. It's like, you're nuts. Like rationality is internally consistent that Orla is presenting. It's all giving very, very good reasons.
Right. Sorry, just to interrupt. Do you think that this Orla character is supposed to be like Satan, like in the way Paralandra you have?
Well, here we go. This is the part okay. That's unbelievable. And the thing I want to get at is that Lewis is always identifying the break between rationality and truth, which is the space that Hegel's thinking occupies with paradox, and the break between the map and the territory, which is I like to call it the Gödel point, but that is the point of the utmost decision, the critical decision. That is the decision of absolute knowing, basically. But it's also the same place where everything can fall apart. And this is what I mean by that. So Orla pulls out a knife, and she takes out her arm and she stabs it slightly, and Psyche's losing her mind. And Orla says, "If you don't leave your husband, I will kill myself." And Psyche looks at Orla, it's like, "You got to trust me." And she's like, "No, you're crazy." And Psyche, you know, looks at, you know, Orla, and she says something like, she says, "Like, you know, I am learning different things about love that I did not know. I feel like I am looking into a dark pit. You know that my love for you runs to my deepest root, and that I could not replace it with a newer love. But now I see that love can be used as a means of politics and maneuver, and an instrument of torture. Yes, sister, I have learned. I am not sure if I like your love better than hatred. No matter what happens next, something between us has died here." And so Psyche then goes, so that Orla doesn't kill herself. She goes and takes a vow to her sisters to do it, and takes off the god's mask. And the valley is just full of wailing and terror, and it's full of light. And Psyche, you know, then Orla hears this horrible wail across the valley. And Psyche, and then the god appears to Orla for a minute and says something along the lines of like, "Psyche has been exiled. Now her days will be full of hunger and thirst and treading upon hard rocks." And so then Orla has to live with the weight of what she did, of which she had every reason to think she was doing the right thing, because everything Psyche was doing was crazy. And yet, because of the nature of the god, it was simply the case that Orla had to believe in Psyche. And yet, there was every reason not to believe. There was a radical break between the true and the rational, the coherent and the correspondent. What can be known only, you could only know what Psyche knew by doing it. by participating in it, by being part of it. Rationality could never give you that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's Lewis is what he's that break between the true and the rational, the correspondence and the coherence, the map and the territory. That is the space that Lewis is highlighting is the difference between salvation and damnation. What you do in that space is what is so critical. And that is the space also that Hegel is suggesting in a different way, that we are heading toward in consciousness. The development is heading toward a space of that decision where you will decide what you are going to do. It is precisely, this is what's so important in Hegel. It is precisely the point of absolute knowing, which is also when you can destroy the world. You know, there is a progress in Hegel, but the progress is one that if you screw up, it's the worst that has ever been. It is precisely the potentiality that makes possible the greatest of all possible worlds, that makes possible the worst of all possible worlds. And what's so brilliant about Lewis, and I could certainly keep you here for another hour, and I will not do that. The brilliance about Lewis is that he locates the critical moment at the breaks between the rational and the true. And he also locates that at the point where damnation and salvation is determined. And he also locates it at the point where precisely the only way to know is to do, is to be in it, to be participating. Where standing outside of it in rationality, following what according to that is the right thing, you will damn the person you love most to wailing and thirst and treading upon hard rocks. And that's what Lewis will articulate over and over again. And it's also in the Four Loves, where you disorder the Four Loves. Till We Have Faces is an important book. And the phrase is also, how can we meet face to face till we have faces? How can we meet face to face till we have faces? And there's this beautiful idea, if we see that in a Hegelian sense, that we don't have faces until we move in the direction of the absolute knowing, of which requires accepting our own limits, the role of paradox and contradiction, and developing consciousness for itself according to that, as opposed to the temptations of death drives and effacements found in AA thinking that soothe us, but not call us to something more, of which we can see in the character of psyche.
Right. And that reminds me of in The Great Divorce, because I haven't read Till We Have Faces, but I have it right in front of me. So I'm definitely going to get on that. In The Great Divorce, you were talking about how comes a certain point where you just have to do it. And if you don't do it, you're not going to get it. And that's really how they determine who's going to be, how damnation is or salvation is determined.
Yeah, every character is brought to a decision. They're all brought to these decisions.
There's the I think it's near to the end. There's someone who's very far gone, right? And then they have I'm like just a really big person, kind of a saint or something, come, and it's like you need to make your decision now. You have to do it now. And like I guess there's like really I know in the Christian idea, if you have an idea of eternal hell, and like not because it's like God is standing at the door holding it, right? It's because as you said, quoting Lewis, that the door to hell is locked from the inside. Like there comes a point where you have to make a decision, and just not making a decision will that is a decision in and of itself, right? And so I would like, how would you incorporate that within what you're talking about? And I know you, and I want you to talk about this as well, the idea that true isn't rational. I know you guys wrote a whole book on that, right? It's on Amazon, which will be linked in the description.
Good man.
And like, how does that fit in within your ontology, this idea that there comes a certain point where you have to make a decision, and being inactive is itself an action, but more like a negative action, which will lead you to damnation?
Well, and I think it's very important. So a few things. One, the choice that Orla leads herself into is the result of a series of choices that all kind of build upon one another. Also, too, there's the idea, you can almost look at it this way, because Orla in the end, I won't give away the ending. There's always a possibility of quote unquote redemption, but the difficulty of the redemption is radical to the severity of the bad choice. It's almost like intensity. Like if I take a ball and I throw it lightly, or maybe a boomerang, it will come back, but it will come back. But if I throw it really hard, it will take a long time. So there's almost like an issue of intensity. Like you can make certain choices where the intensity of the consequences is so great that the probability of you coming back from them is like very low. And it's almost like what you in Christian theology, there's the idea of practically damned. You're not technically damned, but you're practically damned because of the intensity of that choice. And then the mechanisms of self-deception and so on will come to where you will not choose to turn around, even though you theoretically could, because grace abounds. I've always found personally in my thinking, the distinction between technical and practical is quite useful. Like I meant, like earlier, capitalism doesn't technically have to become a mixed market system or with corporations and so on, but it might practically always become one. Likewise, Marxism doesn't technically have to become Stalinism or something, but it could be the case that it practically always does just because of how things unfold. And so similarly, you can have a situation where damnation, you could have choices that are so severe that it is practically the case that you will never come about, or maybe or it's 80% that you won't come about and 20% that you will, and so on and so forth. So the language of damnation in salvation in that context could have more of a probability theory. Then it's sort of like, well, you made the wrong choice, you turned the wrong corner, shoot, didn't go on, and different things like that. Also, quite importantly, there's something interesting that Lewis does in that book where he's kind of suggesting once a character makes a different choice, and so I don't ruin the plot. But, maybe I can, because great literature, the more you know the plot, the more you want to read it. We said that at the beginning, right?
Right.
So there's this idea, where Lewis mentioned, like, he's like, if you choose to go to heaven, you look back on your life and it's like it was all heaven. But if you go to hell, you look back in your life and it was all hell. There's kind of this reach back in time thing he mentions in the Great Divorce, I think it was. So likewise, with the Till We Have Faces, once a character makes a redemptive choice, then actually the decision that caused all the despair is kind of absorbed into the redemption and intensifies the redemption and makes it more glorious, actually. Now, it didn't have to. Like, if they never turned around, the damnation would have just been damnation and nothing good would have come. But once it's turned around, it's like incorporated into it to actually make it all the better, sort of like the negations of, abstraction, negation, concretion. Like there's a kind of redemption, like sin, but it actually intensifies it now. That doesn't mean it's good that you went through it necessarily, but it does mean that it can always, according to how God does things, be incorporated in a manner that brings it to a higher state, which would get us into the weeds of theological consideration. But in the same way, what's really important is, therefore, what we're saying is damnation, salvation in the context of that story is a result of a perpetual reconstitution. Because you made this terrible choice, you then tend to make a series of choices every single day that continues to participate in that terrible choice that you made. So it's always reconstitution, just like the absolute re-knowing, redoing. It looks like determinism because it's like the same effect, but there's always a re-participation in that makes it look like a straight line, but really it's more like a bunch of circles that are heading in the same direction, right? So similarly, that's actually a really important concept of time that Hegel also, I think, wants to bring us on absolute knowing, because maintaining absolute knowing, since at any point can become that damnation moment with psyche, because the progress is always a contingent progress, there has to be absolute knowing isn't like a point you make and then it's a straight line or a straight ascensing. It's like, you have to keep reconstituting it. You have to keep redoing it and doing it in the right way. And if you stop, in the same way that I mentioned a positive reaching back that incorporated it all, well, if you stop the absolute, it can reach back and do it negative. And suddenly, as it kind of reaches back in time, we were saying in the Great Divorce, and it was always part of heaven. Likewise, it can reach back in time and always be part of hell. Likewise, it can reach back in time and make it always part of the process of absolute knowing, or it can reach back in time and make it like it was never part of the process of absolute knowing. It can reach back in time and make it a negation that makes possible a sublation, or it can reach back in time and make it all an effacement. So it's important to understand that role of time as well, because there's a perpetual reconstitution of the meaning of it all relative to the now.
Right. And so there comes a point when you have all this development towards the end where you make your final decision. And as you were talking about, it's almost like it's not like it retroactively changes. The future changes the past in the sense that it's given its meaning, because the meaning of the past the past only has meaning in relation to the future. So you're determining what the past was based on your final action. And it's that final action for Lewis in The Great Divorce. Time is very important because it's almost like time. Like I like to think of it as literally time was closing in on the people in purgatory, whatever you want to call it. And that is why, for example, angels are in Christian theology. They are beyond time, and because and they don't change because they're not subject to time, and because they don't change, they have one choice. They have that same choice, and they can either fall but angels are not like humans who can grow and have these multiple choices, but eventually they are going to have to make a final decision, because eventually time doesn't just go on forever. There is a telos to time, and it will end in eternity, because that is the full actualization of time. Because if you think about it, the present is just a slice of eternity. That's all the present is. And the past and the future technically have no being in that sense. And it has no being. If you have no idea of eternity, you cannot think anything. You cannot think the past and future, because you can only have the present. That's only what has being. But the present is an infinitely small regression. And I guess we could even say that this is really what hell is instead of choosing eternity in that act, you're choosing the present, which is itself. So the present is like St. Augustine talks about this in the Confessions. He's talking about time, how he even says he just couldn't figure it out. He couldn't figure out what time is. He just gave up, I guess. He tried his best. And because time for him is always becoming other to itself. But if you are embracing this, the present in this way, you are, as you're saying, like hell is like a dust ball. I think that's how it's described. It doesn't even have room for an apple, right? Because it is this very small place, which is ultimately yourself, because you without the other are infinitesimally small, and that's the night of the world. That's what hell is, etc. Right?
Oh yeah. Well, another way to look at it is hell is all. You can make a choice that then sets the trajectory of your constant constitution that is hellish, or you can make a choice that's going to set it in a certain direction that makes your perpetual reconstitution heavenly, per se. It's like, for example, when people get a divorce and have irreconcilable differences, which is interesting because technically no differences are irreconcilable. You could always make up, but there comes a point where people are like, no, they can't. They technically could always make up, but not practically because of the wounds and so on and so forth.
Sorry to interrupt. That would be for Christianity. That would be the difference between venial and mortal sin.
Yes.
There's really how you can conceptualize mortal sin. It's not that the action itself is just so like as Augustine says, it's not the stuff. Nothing that exists is bad in Christian theology, because evil is non-existence. But you have you are right. Evil is non-existence. So really, a mortal sin is severing your relationship to God, in the same way as it's an irreconcilable difference in the sense that you need to. Like the difference, I guess, between humans is you reach a point sometimes where there can be no forgiveness. But of course, with the Christian God, there always is forgiveness. But that's what a mortal sin is. And that is what the distinction is. It's breaking the relationship more than can be healed. Just like you need to do some extra steps to heal the wound you have caused, or the divide you've made.
Well, the critical notion there, if evil is a privation and a privation of being, I guess in Timothy, everything that God created is good. It brought with thanksgiving. So there's a certain relation, a certain orientation. What's very interesting is what C.S. Lewis often depicts in his Christian theology is in fact a idea that the bad, the evil, is a result of disordered relationships, disordered trajectories, projections, but that the evil is not located in the substance. It is located in the relation to the substance. And that would make sense if subject is substance, and subjects are primarily relational. This is very similar into Hegel's thinking. that the issue is order. There's nothing bad with science. The problem is when science effaces the subject. But there's also a problem when consciousness is trying to be for itself and it's not doing so in concert dialectically with materiality. There is a certain relationship that is needed for the process of absolute knowing and a certain order. There is a certain order that consciousness tends to emerge into higher states of consciousness. And likewise, that there is a certain order, a certain proportion, I guess is the term you'll hear, that is used. These are, I think what you see in CS, like that kind of thinking, you actually will see quite a bit of parallels. And also too, that if you have this idea that there's that the thinking of this world, you're in the world, but not of it, right? That idea. That's really interesting. That sounds a lot like the map isn't the territory, right? You're in this world, but not of it, that there is some kind of break between the truth and what you tend to think is true, because why is Satan as a deceptor in different things and so on and so on. Oh, I want to know when you mentioned about angel, so angels are constituted by a choice where humans are reconstituted because they are in time. They're always reconstituted. Yes. And the is important in the same way that the infinity, which is a human thing because it requires time, because it comes out of the finite, is therefore reconstituted by the finite. There's a perpetual reconstitution of the infinite by the finite. And a way to think, I always like to think about the infinite with the in parentheses, which means the most present dimension of the infinite is the finite, of which is in the infinite. If the finite is in the infinite, and it's kind of a loop in that sort of grammar structure. But the finite is always reconstituting the infinite in the same way that the human is always reconstituted, whereas angels are constituted. Okay. And so likewise, so again, another way to view this, we go back to that distinction between the truth and the absolute. The truth, everything that is the case, is constituted. It's just constituted. Whereas the absolute is everything that is the case plus us, substance equals subject, is reconstituted. One of the problems with seeking the truth, which is arguably what hard materialism, empiricism, and the meaning crisis are all result. The problem is you're trying to make humans like angels. You're trying to have, the reason we have a meaning crisis is because we're trying to get an identity of constitution, which means we would have to be minds without bodies, because, angels are minds without bodies, and we are not minds without bodies. We are minds with bodies. So if we are minds with bodies, but we are seeking a constitution in the truth, then we are trying to make ourselves angels. And that means we're going effacement. That is not a negation. That is effacement. What we need to do is accept that we are minds with bodies and therefore seek reconstitution, which would mean we are toward the absolute. And so absolute knowing entails finding identity in reconstitution, the perpetual act, the constant doing, the constant daily repentance, if you will, the turning toward the right way to be rightly ordered. So that so that all things can be new. It's funny, the Bible ends there, like all things are new. These words are trustworthy, write these down because these words are trustworthy or true. The only way for all things to be new is to be always reconstituted. And it is in the absolute that you have an onto-epistemological, if you will, vision of reconstitution. And so that would be why I like Hegel. I've enjoyed learning about Hegel and how I do think Hegel has something to do with the meaning crisis. And that if we become more Hegelian as such, that will help us escape Nash equilibriums that are causing democracy to have a suboptimal result. And will ultimately, I think, open us up to a certain orientation that will make possible in our lives experiences of beauty, such as that dance in the middle of the space trilogy. Because it is only conceivable that an experience like that would be possible where the I equals other, where the other is part of a dance with you, where the fire and the rose are one, I guess, as Eliot said, and neither are consumed.
Right. You know what? You somehow managed to tie every general topic we've talked about into one little I don't know what to call it, just brilliant exposition there. So I think that's a good place to end.
You're very kind. I kept you an extra 40 minutes. You're just so delightful. I couldn't help it. I could not help myself.
Loved it.
It was a delight.
So to conclude, you have to plug yourself. Got to tell people where to go to find you and the stuff you make with your wife, Michelle. All wonderful work. It'll all be in the description, but maybe just give like a brief overview again, just to remind people like what do you do and where can you find the stuff that you do, and Yeah.
I'm not actually sure what I do. It's, reconstituted every day or something like that.
Right.
Michelle's squash casserole is extraordinary. Our wedding thing. Oh, yeah, plug our stuff. Not that, but I tell you, the squash casserole is quite good. That's one of the stuff that, we do. But ogrose.com writing, so things like that. I also teach piano. To anyone who's interested in that pattern method where it's using visuals to teach piano, I'd be quite curious. It's all free. It's on YouTube. I would just like more people to try it. I'd be curious if it works. If it doesn't work, but it's been fun to do that because it's a way to learn music with improv, kind of an improv style, as opposed to being bound by the map, if you will. So ogrose.com, we do, OG Rose conversations. We have the pleasure and honor of having conversations with such as Mr. Telospound and Trey. And one of the reasons why this is something that we love to do is because it gives us an opportunity to meet and speak with people such as yourself. So thank you for that.
And thank you for coming on. It was a great discussion. I'm sure my followers are going to love it. And good night.